Good evening, everybody. You're all welcome to another night with a really important guest speaker, Vanessa Beeley. We are absolutely delighted to have you, Vanessa, as one of, three really astounding guests, and to have for you to give up your time so willingly and without hesitation. We really appreciate that. We believe that it's really important to counter the mainstream Western narrative. That's our job as activists as well. And that's why we follow people like you, Vanessa, and there are very few voices like yours out there. We're certainly not going to find them in mainstream media that, will be critical of Western geopolitics. And if you're not actually from the area, or if you haven't visited the area, even alternative journalists, sometimes don't have, I suppose what you have is the privilege of being in the Middle East and traveling there and being on the ground. And what's been most impressive is, Vanessa, your analysis, your following of what's been happening in Syria. And it's not a recent phenomena, obviously. And anybody who has been following you or who wants to go back and look at your work will see that you were very, very clear about the soft power that was at work there through the white helmets, through the NGOs, and how, the intelligence services, MI6, CIA, how they operate there. So it's been very illuminating for me. I don't know everything. I wouldn't claim to know everything, but I would certainly say that your work has helped me shape my understanding of Syria, and was better able, I was more equipped to be able to counter some of the ridiculous stories that we were faced with on the streets, even, Vanessa, amongst Palestine supporters too. So without further ado, I'm going to let you talk just first of all, I suppose, about your work, and your work in particular, your analysis of Syria, and looking even, well, maybe we'll start with the current situation in Syria and then work our way back to all of the investigative work that you uncovered over the last 13 years, really, look
Oh,
back.
don't please, that makes me feel old.
You're not old at all.
Yeah.
And age is only a number
no.
anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, basically, look, what happened on December the 8th, 2024 was a culmination of, one could say, almost 75 years of regime change, clandestine operations, black ops that had been ongoing to topple various Syrian governments that were not complying with the Western agenda, or worse still, were pivoting towards the then Soviet Union, or obviously after 91 towards Russia. I've written basically an article detailing the historical context of what happened in 2011 onwards, and basically demonstrating that this was a repeat operation of what had happened in the late 70s, early 80s, in Syria, when President Hafez al-Assad had the leadership of the country. But even prior to that, since Syria's independence from the French Mandate in 1946, there have been multiple, as I said, clandestine operations, regime change attempts, in many occasions, failed regime change attempts. And what we saw in 2011 had basically been planned really since 9/11. I mean, there are various pointers to that. Of course, there's the famous statement by Wesley Clark that 7 countries would be taken out by the United States, including, of course, Iraq and Syria. If you go back to 1997, the clean break doctrine that was commissioned by then Netanyahu in his government position then, which basically laid out the fact that the road to Damascus was through Baghdad. So therefore that demonstrates why it was very important for Iraq to be destabilized and colonized prior to any attempt to take control in Syria, and to basically make Syria a non-hostile state regarding Israel's security. And then in 2006, there was a Times Magazine article, which I think it was called Syria in Bush's Crosshairs, which again talked about fomenting an uprising, arming and funding militia and proxies to basically overthrow the government. So that was in 2006. In 2005, there was an interview with Christiane Amanpour and President Bashar al-Assad, where she actually openly spoke to him about the potential for regime change. And of course, in 2009, when he basically turned down the Qatari US and I would say Turkish-backed pipeline in favor of the Russian-Iranian pipeline, that was when we started to see things building. As Roland Dumas, the then French foreign minister, admitted in 2013, he'd been approached by British officials telling him, look, we're planning the overthrow of the Syrian government. This was in 2009, and we want you to be a part of it, etc. So the signs were there leading up to 2011. And then, of course, we have the Operation Timber Sycamore that Jeremy Sachs, no, Jeremy or Jeffrey Sachs, I always get him mixed up, spoke about recently in Turkey. And of course, this was Obama's plan to fund the so-called moderate rebels to overthrow the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. We know then that that morphed into what became a terrorist proxy war involving the Free Syrian Army that then basically collaborated with both ISIS and Al-Qaeda to overrun the country. In 2015, September, Russia came in to actually support Syria in its war against terrorism. And for 14 years, really, Syria and its allies withstood disproportionate force because, of course, they were being given air support, although they didn't have it themselves, but they were being given air support by, effectively, by Turkey, the US, and Israel. Israel was working in collaboration with the terrorist factions on the ground in Syria, including Al-Qaeda, later rebranded as HTS. But we have to remember that the current unelected president of Syria, who proclaimed himself president, dissolved the constitution, dissolved the military forces. He was actually the founder of Al-Qaeda in Syria. He was initially with ISIS. He then formed the Nusra Front in Syria, which was Al-Qaeda. And then as he was being more overtly backed by the West and being shown to be the political opposition to President Assad, he basically rebranded himself as the leader of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which formed a coalition of multiple armed groups in Idlib, including, I think, around 40 to 50% foreign Takfiris or extremist mercenaries that came in from countries all over the world, including China, Chechnya, Afghanistan, but also many of them from countries in Europe, including, of course, the UK and the EU. I mean, we can get onto that afterwards. And so in 2024, what we saw was the culmination of 14 years of a terrorist proxy war that was waged against the Syrian people. I think the break point came in around 2020 after the liberation of the eastern suburbs of Damascus that had been under the occupation of extremist groups like Jaish al-Islam, al-Sham, and Al-Qaeda for years, in fact, since 2012. And that was when the then Trump administration brought in the savage Caesar sanctions, which basically not only doubled down on the sanction pressure on the Syrian people. We know historically that sanctions do nothing against the named people that they are allegedly targeting. They target the people in order to make life without dignity, without hope, without infrastructure, without the ability to survive by themselves, and essentially to turn against the state. And this is what happened in 2020. Syria was already under sanctions, but Trump brought in the Caesar sanctions, which, as I said, doubled down on the existing sanctions, which had been in place since 1979, but had then been increased over that period of time. And of course, what the Caesar sanctions did was to punish any country that came to the aid or assistance of Syria. So this, while people sort of think, well, yeah, but sanctions aren't, people survive sanctions. Well, they don't when they're actually preventing any kind of aid from neighboring countries or allied countries. And really, in those last 4 years, what we saw was a rise in corruption. We saw a rise in poverty. I think 90% of people in Syria were below whatever the line of poverty is. They were very, very poor. The army was struggling more in peacetime than it had done in the time of defending its people against this terrorist proxy war to effect regime change in Syria. And so we saw what was the desired effect upon the population in Syria, which was to reduce their standard of living, to prevent any kind of reconstruction or rehabilitation of the country, to enable the rise of corruption. This is standard. You would find that in any country in the world living through those conditions for 14 years. And then basically, I think what had been planned for some time, there was betrayal from within, there was an internal collapse. I will add, it had nothing to do with the Syrian Arab Army, which is what many people are promulgating and blaming the army for surrendering. But the reality is that the betrayal was so great that a large number of the officials in command of the army had been persuaded to betray their own forces. Commanders were taken off the field in the first 2 days of the attack on Aleppo, and were replaced by commanders who pushed the army back and left them in complete confusion and disarray. And that's the point at which they started surrendering, because they actually had no choice. They had no command. They had no communications. It was being done in a way that was very divisive. So some brigades were being told to surrender. Others were being told to keep fighting. So those who were keeping fighting didn't realize that those next to them had surrendered. And so they suddenly found themselves surrounded. There were factions that kept fighting even after the fall of Damascus, including the National Defense Forces of Al-Skalbiya, one of the Christian towns in northern Hama on the borders with southern Idlib. They were still fighting. The day that Damascus actually fell, he wouldn't surrender, and he was forced to surrender pretty much by Russia, who then took the leader of the National Defense Forces to safety in Russia. So, whatever, and bearing in mind that I was on the ground in Hama, in Homs, in Tartus during the battles. So I had a pretty good indication, although I have to say the information release was very confusing, obviously, because it was deliberately being prevented from getting out. And we were receiving very contradictory messages from people we were speaking to. And really, it became clear only on the Friday night, Saturday morning, that Damascus was going to fall. I actually left Syria on the Sunday morning after my house had been surrounded by various terrorist gangs who were firing in the air and firing at whatever targets they decided during the Saturday night. And of course, at that point, Israel started bombing intensively using the bunker buster bombs, the heavy duty bombs, to try and destroy all of the Syrian military infrastructure, the air defense, the military bases, the naval bases, the aircraft, the helicopters, the hangars, the underground facilities, and so on. So Saturday night was I don't quite know how to describe it, but it was a very difficult time. And leaving on the Sunday morning was also quite difficult. The only good thing was that the groups were so concentrated on looting everything that they could find. They were not actually focusing on who was in the cars leaving Syria. So for that reason, I managed to exit safely.
Yeah, that's it's really interesting to hear your own personal experience there at the end and getting out when you say like your house was surrounded and Israel started bombing and all. It just makes it's very, visceral, and you bring us right into the place. But the journey, even you talked about of what happened, is very similar. It reminds me of, one of our activists. He's Sami. He's actually Kurdish, originally from Turkey, but he felt the need to write. And the way that you have described what has happened really mirrors how he has written. I'll send you the article. It's a very short article because we were limited. But again, the reluctance, or to even um for any publisher to take that in Ireland was like, nobody really wanted to touch it or read it even, never mind, publish it. So like the censorship is just unbelievable, even from what's supposed to be revolutionary or alternative media. Like how do you deal with that? Because like telling the truth and being there and exposing it. I know you have a mechanism, and now you have a huge platform and a big following, so you're a trusted source, Vanessa, amongst those people who know. But like, how do we, as little activists back here, what advice do you have for us as, revolutionaries
Um,
wanting to break through this? Even it's a very, very safe alternative media that we have, even through the emergence of like Palestine. There's still a real reluctance to go, oh, are you sure? You know,
yeah.
or there's real
Yeah.
reluctance to embrace the truth, and there's still question, are you sure? Even I did it with Sammy, like, are you sure? I was trying to cross check, you know.
Yeah, no, but I mean, you should. I mean, look, ultimately, I'm not here, as I said to someone on X this morning, I'm not here to convince anyone. I'm only here to present what I consider to be an informed and evidenced opinion. But I'm quite happy to debate civilly with anyone about anything that I'm presenting as my conclusion from what I've experienced and what I've seen, what I've heard. And what I've actually, as I said, evidenced myself after, 10 years working in Syria, 5 years living there, because I moved there in 2019. So I was there for the last years, but I was working there since 2016, going every couple of months to the front lines in Aleppo, in eastern Ghouta, the eastern suburbs of Damascus, and following events from 2016 onwards, although of course I'd been following it prior to that also. Now, I think one of the biggest problems, first of all, of course, what does the West always do? When it's targeting any country for destabilization or for a change of government, it demonizes and criminalizes the leader of that country. We've seen it in Libya, we've seen it in Iraq. Of course, in Libya, we had the terrible ending for Gaddafi. And how many people will now say, after what I call the Hitlerization of Gaddafi, how many people will say, but look at how Libya was then and look how it is now, right? And that's exactly what happened. The war in Syria was not about one man, but that's what the West does. That's what Western media does. It makes Assad or Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein the enemy, and that's what they focus on. But the reality was that the Syrian Arab army was the Syrian people. You know, people talk about the dominance of the Alawites, and they use that as an excuse for the ethnic cleansing that is now ongoing underneath the Al-Qaeda government against the Alawite minorities in Syria, which number around 3 million. But the reality is, if you actually break down those who were in charge of intelligence and security and military and strategy, they were 99.5% Sunni, Sunni Muslim. So, you know, there were many myths that drove the war against Syria. And I guess the most important one for me, in a way, and I'll come on to the Palestinian, the weaponization of the pro-Palestine movement, which again was a very important factor. And that actually affected even those in independent media, like Grayzone. You mentioned Grayzone. It took Grayzone until 2016 to actually see what was happening in Syria and to start flipping their reporting and actually realizing that this was another regime change war. Why? Because they were heavily affected by the pro-Palestine movement in the United States, which is led by the Muslim Brotherhood, who are a faction, a political arm of Islam that were created by the British in Egypt in the late 20s and have been weaponized ever since, particularly in Syria. And you can read CIA, DIA documents that actually outline the use of the Muslim Brotherhood to destabilize Syria, to overthrow governments, to bring in a so-called moderate Sunni businessman class government, right? That's what the West was trying to achieve. And so basically this was a war against one man. This was a war against Assad. But the reality is, and the reality continues to be, that the huge majority of Syrians, be they Christian, be they Alawites, be they Druze, be they Kurds, it doesn't matter, be they Sunni, they don't want to live under a Takfiri project government. They don't want to live in an extremist, fanatic environment, as we're seeing now. And they didn't want to from 2011 onwards. I have multiple testimonies of people who saw the early protests and described them as absolutely horrific. And they actually said to me, this wasn't Syria. We were seeing people that we had never seen before in Syria. They didn't belong in Syria. And that hasn't changed. It hasn't changed. And so therefore, even if Assad had left on day one, the Syrian people would still be resisting what I call the Takfiri project, which was generated by the West with the support of Israel and the Gulf states. And so that's the number one point. But people, you know, and I totally understand it when they're being hammered left, right, and center with stories of moderate rebels and freedom and democracy protests and crackdowns on peaceful protests, which is absolute nonsense. The first people to use weapons were the so-called protesters, and those weapons, of course, were coming in from Libya through Turkey, from Jordan, from Qatar. Qatar was bankrolling the whole affair with billions of funding for the armed groups, predominantly Al-Qaeda, funded by Qatar, and Saudi promoting the Wahhabi groups and ideology. And that would be my first point. So I fully understand it, but historically and contextually, we should have seen the pattern, and we should have known, even in former Yugoslavia, the same, which was pretty much the blueprint for what then happened in West Asia. And then, as I mentioned, the pro-Palestine movement was horribly infiltrated and influenced into thinking Syria was the enemy. And I'm afraid that this was a huge failure in left-wing movements in the West. Many, I'm not going to name them, but most of them, the huge majority, turned against Syria because they'd been sold the line that Syria was against Palestine, it was abusing Palestinians. I don't even really know where to begin with this. I mean, one of the reasons that the war began against Syria was because, of course, it had harbored, to some degree, Hezbollah factions on its territory. It had refused to relinquish its solidarity with Palestine. In other words, Syria had refused to normalize with Israel, and it had refused to abandon its allies in the resistance axis, which of course include Iran. And Hezbollah and Iran were absolutely instrumental in preventing the Al-Qaeda and affiliated terrorist group takeover of Syria, leading to 2024. And that includes, by the way, I mean, again, another line that is regularly, even now, sort of used against those that are speaking about Syria is that, well, they massacred Sunni. No, they didn't massacre Sunni. The huge majority of Sunni Muslims in Syria were fighting against the Takfiris. Right, as I've mentioned, the majority of the leadership of the military, security and intelligence was Sunni. The majority of the Syrian armed forces were Sunni, and they were fighting alongside Hezbollah and Iranian forces to defend their country. And Hezbollah actually was also instrumental in the liberation of the Christian towns inside Syria. Another thing that a lot of people don't know about, they were instrumental in the liberation of Malula, one of the most ancient Christian communities to the northwest of Damascus, known because they still teach and speak Aramaic, the language that is known as the language of Christ. Some people will argue with that, but it's known to be the language of Christ, certainly in Syria. And in the area called Wadi Nasara, which is the Valley of the Christians, Hezbollah were again instrumental in pushing back against the terrorist forces there. In Skelbi and Mehade, that are Orthodox Christian towns that were besieged from 2012, 2013 onwards by various armed factions that were on a daily basis shelling schools, monasteries, hospitals. I know because I was actually living there. Sorry, you muted me.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, can you speak there? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I unmuted myself. So, you know, I was actually, particularly in Skelbia, I was living there for, or spending significant amounts of time there when it was under attack. And I can testify to the fact that not only were they attacking hospitals and schools and kids, I mean, on one particular time, there were 6 children murdered in a morning while they had gone to school, which was on the grounds of one of the monasteries there. Churches were being shelled. Chemical weapons were being used. Again, we hear nothing but the fact that the so-called chemical weapon attacks by the Syrian government, that's another one that I'll come on to. But chemical weapons were actually being used, for example, in Aleppo, to the north of Aleppo, in villages next to Skelbia, and the people suffering from the after effects of whatever that chemical was that was being used. I think at that particular attack, it was chlorine. Were brought to Skelbia Hospital, and I went to speak to them, and they told me how much they had suffered. But of course, organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch didn't ever talk about these attacks. They were completely erased from people's perception in the West. And yes, when we get on to the alleged chemical weapon attacks, which the 3 main ones were Ghouta in 2013, Khan Sheikhoun in 2017, and the Duma attacks in April 2018, when I was actually in Damascus during the final battles to liberate Eastern Ghouta. And again, I personally went to the area that had supposedly been attacked by chemical weapons. And this was only, I think, 24 hours after the alleged attack. And people were setting up market stalls and wandering around perfectly normally. There were absolutely no after effects. I spoke to staff in the medical point that had been treating so-called victims, and they told me no, they came in with smoke inhalation, which is perfectly normal in a war environment. There were no chemicals being used, and suddenly, of course, the white helmets burst in, filming themselves, screaming chemical attack, and started hosing people down, etc., etc. But you don't need to take my word for it. You can take the word of the OPCW inspectors, who actually were on the ground and who later challenged the final OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, final report. And this is all documented, as is the counter evidence to the Ghouta attacks in 2013. And going back to that, of course, we're supposed to understand, or we're supposed to believe, that while the Syrian government had called in the OPCW and UN inspectors, actually related to a terrorist chemical attack in Khan al-Assad to the north of Aleppo. And then as soon as the inspectors land in Damascus, guess what? The Syrian government carries out a chemical weapon attack against its own people in eastern Ghouta. And we're supposed to believe this. Like, I've extensively looked into the alleged chemical weapon attacks, and I will say categorically, in my opinion, they were staged. They were staged predominantly by the white helmets. Children were used in what I can only describe as snuff videos. They were killed on film and then shown to closed sessions in the UN. There was an attack in March 2015 in Samin, and the Swedish Doctors for Human Rights, after I contacted them, actually investigated the footage that was shown in the UN. And all of the doctors who viewed the video footage described it as, if the child were not already dead, they would be dead after the procedure that was carried out on them on film. So as I said, snuff videos were actually produced by the entities that were creating, staging, and then basically disseminating the so-called evidence for these chemical attacks that were used to criminalize the Syrian government. And so, but at the same time, yes, I do understand that people get overwhelmed by the narratives that are being basically tsunamied at them, because there isn't any variation. It's copy-paste journalism. They all take their feeds from Associated Press or Reuters and so on, and then basically they just put it out there. And you had embedded journalists in Istanbul that were working for, legacy media, whether it's The Guardian, Channel 4, BBC, etc., who were then tasked with producing the stories, producing the evidence. I mean, I've written extensively about this. Various other people have also written extensively about it. But you've only got to look at I think it was the 2020 document leaks from the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, which were deemed to be credible because the then Foreign Secretary Dominic Saab was complaining about who had released the documents or who had managed to hack them. So clearly they were verified. And this showed an extensive operation to embed citizen journalists, to find witnesses, to provide testimony to the likes of the BBC, to basically corroborate the evidence needed to justify British foreign policy. And in fact, there was an April 2017 UK Foreign Office draft document that actually stated that the white helmets, I'm paraphrasing slightly, should corroborate British foreign policy. So hang on, what does this mean? Does this mean that those on the ground producing the evidence should produce evidence that corroborates UK foreign policy? Or should UK foreign policy be based on the evidence that is provided? Do you see what I mean? So no, the simple fact is that organizations like the White Helmets, which were established by a former British military operative, James LeMessurier, in Turkey and Jordan, not in Syria, in 2013. LeMessurier had previously, of course, worked in a number of UK Foreign Office intervention theatres, including in Kosovo, Pristina, 1999, when he was tasked, and he himself has spoken about the correlation between his work in Kosovo and his work with the White Helmets in Syria in an interview with Georgetown University. But he was working in Kosovo, Pristina in 99 under the leadership of Bernard Kouchner, who was then UN, I'm not sure what I would call him, representative in Pristina, who was, of course, accused of organ trafficking with the KLA, setting up the yellow houses where they would take Serbian children and captives and remove their organs. And at the same time, James Lemessurier was working on the transformation of the KLA, which was predominantly Al-Qaeda and Albanian warlords. Again, the British weaponizing and harnessing jihadist, or I don't like using the term jihadist actually, but Takfiri proxies to carry out their dirty work in former Yugoslavia. Again, that's been well documented by Mark Curtis in his book on the subject. And Lemessurier was transforming the KLA into the Kosovo Security Corps. So he was transforming an organization that at the time was running proven organ trafficking operations. Carla Del Ponte's book again went into huge detail through her investigation into their operations. And he then went on to form the White Helmets in Turkey as a former British military intelligence officer, who were then embedded with Al-Qaeda, and they stand accused of running operations like child trafficking and organ trafficking. And I will give you an insight into this. In 2017, I took the file of all the testimonies that I had collated of people telling me about the White Helmets running these organ trafficking operations. They detailed to me the cost of the organs depending on the age of the child or the age of the victim. And I actually took the whole file to the UN, to the Russian mission, but they put me in touch with a high-level EU representative at the time who gave me an audience. And I will never forget when they said to me, I'm not going to say names because it was off the record, but when they said to me, nothing will happen because the White Helmets are a political organization, nobody is going to investigate them, but I'm not surprised. So, you know, when people tell me, and even journalists in the independent media sphere have said to me, well, no, but that's a bit extreme, like organ trafficking. You know, even if it is extreme, even if, let's say, for argument's sake, it's not happening, why isn't there an inquiry? Why isn't there an investigation? British taxpayer money is funding and still funding the White Helmet organization. The leader of the White Helmets now holds a post in the unelected government, which is dominated by Al-Qaeda and foreign mercenaries in Syria. Why is he not being investigated for past crimes? Why is Jalani not being investigated for past crimes? He's been allowed to change his name to Ahmed al-Shara. He's been now legitimized by President Trump and the majority of the EU and the UK officials. And yet nobody is demanding an investigation into his past crimes. If there should be an investigation into President Assad's past crimes, why is there no investigation into the current government's past crimes? Why? Because they're prepared to normalize with Israel. They're prepared to join the Abraham Accords. They're prepared to cooperate with the US against Iran. They're prepared to expel Hezbollah. They're prepared to accept a Turkish-Qatari pipeline. See what I mean? So when you do what the West wants you to do, it's fine. You can do whatever you want. You can continue the ethnic cleansing against Alawites, Christians, and Sunnis that don't agree with your ideology. No one will say a word.
Yeah, like this is interesting, Vanessa, from like I'm just thinking about this, the week that has passed and the conversations. And on the last two occasions where we had Zoom meetings with Frank McGuinness and Kit Clarenberg, we ended on quite a positive note of that Zionism is on the way out. And I was like, you know, I want to hear that. I want to
Oh,
believe
me
it.
too.
But then, whenever I knew this conversation was coming up, and I was looking forward to put that to you, because when you hear about what's happening in Syria and you realize that Zionism isn't something that's contained to Palestine, and also in our message, we always feel it's not contained even to the Middle East,
Exactly.
that, and some people will dispute this, and it's good, I think, to have a conversation about who's leading who or what's controlling what, and people get caught up with Donald Trump. Like, I'm listening to YouTube all of the time, and everybody's talking about, the Donald, like you say, the personality, this one person is to blame. So it's the same with the figure of Donald Trump. If he's a loose cannon, like if we just got rid of him, it wouldn't be like, look at what was happening before, like as if
Mm.
US imperialism is a new phenomena. So I think those who are genuinely anti-imperialist, or have, sorry, an understanding of imperialism, maybe recognize, like, I know you're saying it's a bit of a copy and paste. Look at what happened in Libya. We should know. Look at what happened before in Yugoslavia. We should know. We should see the trend. We should see the tactics of divide and conquer. But we don't. The problem is we're not,
Mm.
we're still not seeing in the West, or maybe we're only waking up to it now, where even when we have exposes like yours, there still is, is it a colonial mindset? Are we unwilling to unlearn? You know, or why are we still quoting Amnesty International and talking about Human Rights Watch when we know that these organizations are so, and this is euphemistic, this has been kind, so flawed, so why,
Yeah.
so, and then you look at Al Jazeera, and then you start to understand why, because so many people who would have relied on mainstream media for their news, like RT or BBC, thought they were making a revolutionary switch to Al Jazeera, and they were becoming
Mm.
enlightened. And then you look at Al Jazeera, and you can't blame people for
Mm.
um being anti-Assad, because still the reporting in Al Jazeera
Yeah.
doesn't talk about Syria. It keeps everything is Assad, the fall of the
Mm.
Assad regime.
Mm.
So the framing of it. So I suppose we can't, I'm trying not to be too cross about how, people perceive, but like in this time of, this is an opportunity for us to learn and realize, if we contain Zionism to
Mm.
Palestine, I think we're at risk of missing the point and
Yep.
sitting back and going, oh, it's all ending, thank God, it's going to end eventually, and then that'll be it. So, what's your view
Mm.
on Zionism, or, you know, and
Yeah.
The Zionist entity?
I think, and to some degree, even regionally, people see or connect Zionism only to Israel, and possibly to the influence that the lobby has in the US, in the EU, and in the UK, and they kind of forget about the Zionist movement, because Israel, as a sort of squatter illegal state, was born out of the Zionist movement, which when it began, it was described by many Jews as another anti-Semitic movement, right? Because they saw what it was. And people forget that the Zionist movement has extended and expanded way beyond Israel. Israel really is only the tip of the spear for me. And so therefore, when people talk about the possible collapse of Israel, and I'm certainly not disagreeing with that in the sense that there is potential for an internal kind of civil war between the the right extremists and the far right extremists, because I don't consider that there's any left wing left in Israel. As Alistair Kirk, former MI6, has said, 90% of the population in Israel support the genocide and extermination of Palestinians. But there is if you like, a battle between the Knesset and the renewal of organizations like Ergun and Stern, the Zionist terrorist factions. So that's true. But my argument is even if you end Israel, Israel will only be ended if that is with agreement with the Zionist movement. Or if the US, for example, is going to displace the Zionists or the Israelis to some degree and make it an actual military base, whereas before, of course, it has just been, an outreach agent for US military and intelligence and surveillance in the region. Perhaps that role is coming to an end. Perhaps. We're seeing now US military private contractors inside Gaza. There is talk of there being private military contractors, US based, being stationed in Gaza to provide the aid. People will have to provide biometric facial recognition in order to prove that they're good Palestinians so they can eat and get medical aid, right? And we know that what the Israelis have developed reference the kind of barbaric smart cities, for example, in Hebron, where they're taken to the extreme. We know the surveillance of Palestinians, the potential random shooting and assassinations that are carried out by the Zionists on a daily basis in the occupied territories. I was in Gaza in 2012 and 2013. Even then, the surveillance on the perimeter of Gaza that was under the control of the Zionists was insane. Automatic machine guns that would go off at a set distance, and the distance would keep being changed. So if the farmers approached 2 meters one day and it was safe, the next day it wouldn't be safe and they'd be shot. The AI, the Lavender AI, the what were dreadful names that they called it, gospel AI, that were basically used to identify Palestinians for mass assassination as part of, basically genocide technology is what Israel has been developing. But it doesn't stop inside Israel. For example, in the UK, and I've been saying this for months, look at the 2030 roadmap between Israel and the UK. You will be shocked to what extent Israel is already embedded in every sector of British society, from health to education to cyber to security to defense, across the board, right? On the pretense of after COVID pandemic, whether you agree with that or not, I don't. Israel basically infiltrated, you could almost call it a state capture of the UK, and the same in the US, and I'm pretty sure the same in the EU, because there are multiple organizations like CRIF, for example, in France, that is there specifically to expand Israeli influence in Europe. And that is what's happening. Go to the 2030 roadmap if you don't believe me. And if you look at what's actually happening, the fallout from, for example, the spy unit in Israel, Unit 8200, how many technology companies now in the UK, for example, were either established by former Unit 8200 or are staffed by former Unit 8200. The Zionist movement has huge influence in every single sector. It influences our opinions. It influences the media. Well, it owns most of the media. It influences education. It influences health. It influences defense. All of our defense information is being stored on Zionist owned and operated clouds. Are people happy about that? A genocidal entity has access to your health data, to defense data, to every single aspect of personal data in the UK. I'm not happy about that. And so therefore, when you talk about the end of imperialism or the end of Zionism, I think it's way too soon to be talking about that. Much as I would love to be able to say, yes, it's a reality, I don't think it is. I don't think we've even started the war yet. I think we're just on the fringes, and the resistance, whether it's in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iran, Iraq, are the front lines against the final descent of society into what would, in my opinion, be a hell that is being managed by the transnational ruling elite that are dominated by the Zionist movement and controlled by the Zionist movement and funded by the Zionist movement. So yeah, you know, I would absolutely love to be able to say, yeah, you know, Israel's going to collapse, the US is going to collapse, imperialism is over. But you've only got to look at what's happened in Syria. You know, what has Trump managed to basically achieve through blood money from the Gulf states? I mean, he's just managed to secure, what is it, billions in defense contractor trade with Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Boeing is you know, jumping up and down in glee with the billions of revenue coming in from Qatar. But what has he achieved? He's achieved Shadar, or you know, Jolani as I call him because I refuse to use his rebranding, who is former Al Qaeda and is still operating as Al Qaeda through his militants, the majority, or at least half of which are foreign, in Syria, is normalization with Israel under the Abraham Accords. And as I said, the commitment to cooperating with the US against Iran. What are the defense contracts about with Saudi Arabia and Qatar and so on? I mean, Saudi Arabia, maritime security, the only reason it needs maritime security is against Iran. The only reason it needs air defense and air support is war against Iran, because they would not receive those weapons if Israel perceived them to be a threat to Israel's security in the region.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. There's a comment just come in. Thank you to Dorothy, like talking about techno-feudism. Biggs is where we're headed. Yanis Varoufakis speaks about that and has about it a lot. The tyranny of big tech. So thanks for that comment, Dorothy. I just at this stage am conscious of time. I'd like that it's not just me
Yeah.
steering the conversation. So I'd like to open it up. There's a few people here. If they would have a comment or a question for Vanessa, you're welcome to put your hand up and speak. Or I can invite you. Stephen, you look like you're on the move. So do you?
I am. I'm actually
Are
getting
you
onto
able to talk?
I'll give it a shot. I'm actually getting on a bus, but sure. No, my question is refers to what Vanessa was talking about earlier. First of all, I want to say absolutely brilliant conversation, Vanessa. I mean, this is enlightening. Sounds like the wrong word because it's so depressing, but it is so revealing.
I'm sorry.
Of how deluded we've been. But I guess that's where my question points to is how, like, what do you think explains why so many, you even mentioned the gray zone who were eventually came on board, but you know, so many, you know, media outlets who would consider themselves to be highly skeptical, certainly when it comes to empire narratives, were willing to swallow whole, you know, almost kind of ludicrous stories like the White Helmets. And the only thing that comes to my mind as a possible explanation is that within us, there is still a desire to believe that the empire ain't all bad, you know, that there's something we can believe. Anyway, I don't want to preempt your response. Just if you could, because I'm sure you've thought about this a lot, like what the hell explains our willful credulity on this?
Yeah, that's a very difficult one to respond to. I mean, I gave a number of the reasons that I think people were very badly deceived on Syria. One was the weaponization of the pro-Palestine movement, which of course is a very emotional subject for many people. And so therefore it was very hard to break away from that. I would say in some of the talks that I did in the UK, that was where I came most under attack. Particularly if you look at, for example, the narratives around Yarmouk camp, which, if you remember, was certainly what was driving the pro-Palestine movements against Syria at the time. And in reality, again, this is going to get complicated. It was actually Hamas, the factions within Hamas, that were to some degree collaborating with Israel against Syria, who were in Yarmouk camp and were enabling the occupation of the Yarmouk suburb, because it wasn't really a camp, by Nusra Front. Now, I'm going to have to slightly explain that, because I know there are also a lot of people who say Israel created Hamas and this was all a false flag to lead to the current genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. To some degree, there were members of the leadership of Hamas who were in collaboration, cooperation with the Gulf states, as I said, Qatar, and by default, Israel. One of those was Khalid Mashal. From 2017 to 2021, Syed Hassan Nasrallah, the now assassinated Secretary General of Hezbollah, had been working on normalizing relations between Hamas and Damascus, because Hamas had effectively betrayed Syria during the regime change war. Normalization came about in 2021 with a change in the leadership, the emergence, or rather the strengthening of the Qassam brigades that are leading the resistance against Israel right now. They're the military wing of Hamas, and to a large degree disconnected from the political wing. So it is horribly complicated. I do understand why people became very sort of binary in their thinking on this, because it's very difficult to try and explain. And equally, I go against this idea that the whole of October 7th was a false flag led by Hamas to lead about the genocide for Israel. I don't agree with that either, because if you look at someone like Yahya Sinwar, who then obviously had the leadership of Hamas and the Qassam brigades, it was clear that he was pro-resistance. The way he died as a absolutely dedicated to resistance martyr in Gaza, and overnight became an icon really for the resistance factions. So it is very complicated, and I do understand that for most people, they don't want to go and look into these complexities, and very few people, as you said quite rightly, were reporting on them. And I think that's a failure of independent media, you know, because automatically, like I was in Gaza in 2013 when Israel bombed Damascus, and everybody thought it was a nuclear bomb, etc. And I had a meeting with one of the spokespeople for Khalid Mashal. And I asked him, I said, you know, do you condemn what Israel has done just now in Damascus? He said, no, not really. I mean, Damascus crossed Israel's red line, and my jaw just fell. I was like, what? He said, they crossed their red line. They were providing weapons for Hezbollah. Of course they're going to bomb them. So at that point in 2013, I understood something was very wrong in the Hamas leadership, because Syria had historically been an ally of Palestine. The reason the Palestinian resistance have the weapons they have now is thanks to Syria. Syria was manufacturing the majority of the rockets and missiles used by both the Palestinian resistance and by Hezbollah. But this is not mentioned. The Syrian Arab Army had an entire brigade, Liwa al-Quds, who were all Palestinian. And it was Liwa al-Quds who liberated East Aleppo from the Takfiri groups. But none of this sort of depth is gone into. And as I said, I think I said to you in message, you know, if you're going to be a journalist, and I hold myself to account, you can't profess expertise on a conflict or on a very complicated situation unless you're prepared to go there, unless you're prepared to go and actually talk to people on the ground. For example, India, Pakistan, I can't profess myself an expert. If I go there and if I actually spend months trying to understand the complexities, I can to some degree start talking about it. But I think the danger is now independent media is heading towards being nothing but a sort of YouTube arena in which people don't actually break out of the box of what I would call mainstream independent media narratives, if that makes sense.
That's a
And
very
I
good
think
way.
this is, you know, I think this is something that we as journalists really have to berate ourselves for and say, we owe it to our public, to our audience, to actually go to the places we're talking about. Because if we don't, I can safely say, as someone who lived in Syria, spent considerable time in Syria, it is so much more complicated when you're on the ground. Because suddenly you get all of these different opinions, you actually see what's happening, you actually witness what's happening, and you develop a much more nuanced view, in my opinion, than people who are sitting outside and who are being influenced by the lobbies and by, you know, for example, in America, the Muslim Brotherhood lobby is extremely strong. And so therefore, if you're pro-Palestinian, the same in the UK, actually, if you're pro-Palestinian, you're very much influenced by that Muslim Brotherhood lobby. Democracy Now! Didn't have anyone on except Muslim Brotherhood protagonists. And I know that because when I was one of the few Western journalists in Aleppo during the liberation in November, December 2016, someone put me in touch with Democracy Now! To go on and actually talk about my experience on the ground. And the producer wrote back to me and said, well, no, I don't think we can have you on because, you know, you've reported against the white helmets. I'm like, okay. I mean, this just says everything to me. So you don't want to even hear a diverging view from on the ground. You just want to maintain the narrative that you're being paid to maintain, right? And unfortunately,
Censorship
yeah,
continues then.
you know, people put a lot of faith into what they perceive as being independent outlets like Democracy Now! And unfortunately, that's what happens. And I do also have to say that we all, I'm going to put myself in that as well, we all tend to have a bit of a goldfish brain when it comes to new situations. You know, we forget, as you call the tech tyrants, are running all these operations, whether it's COVID, whether it's pharmaceutical related, they're running them all. So shouldn't we at least kind of take a step back with each new drama that is being universally reported across all mainstream media outlets and just take a breath, take a step back and think, who's benefiting from this? You know, I'm not talking from a position of what I consider to be superiority at all, because I learned this the hard way myself. I was an ordinary person before 2011, 2012, when I just started to get involved in figuring out what was going on. So, you know, everybody is capable of it.
I think that's a good baseline to start on who's benefiting. You
Yeah.
know, as a question, who's and who will capitalize on it. There's a few people here, there's eight of us, there's not that many of us, like there's space for, I'd love to hear from like Dorothy, you write yourself, and as I know you've your Substack, but also I think what I can say about Dorothy, she's an Irish activist and writer, Vanessa, is like, I know from your poetry, Dorothy, I remember that one particular poem that I always go back to, then they will come from, then before Syria, before December 2024, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Iran, in that, I can't remember the name of the poem, then they will come for us, is it?
World's End, I think it was.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
exactly. Yeah. Oh yeah. So first of all, I mean, I'm a writer in the way that a lot of people write in the world, that we have so much on our chest and we need to get it out. And so basically, and Substack is great for that. And I just publish some poetry. I mean, Roisin is very kind always to me, but like my activism, my waking up was Gaza, and I think that's so everything, you know, and maybe as well too. I think it allows people like me to be less, like, I wasn't in a pro-Pal movement before October 2023. So I think I've learned definitely to trust no one. Trust no one, just nothing that I read. because there's been so much, and also obviously being here. I mean, Roisin does great talks on here, and knowing Sammy as well too, and kind of, but a lot of people, like you're right, people are overwhelmed. There's so much out there. Like even I'm, like I said, crying. Like I was making my tea at the beginning, which is why I wasn't on camera, and I was actually crying and listening to you talk about your experience over there, and listening to, I could just imagine all of the Syrian people, and even the army. And I'm like, I think there are no good armies, but there are good people within armies. And I thought of all those poor Syrian men, and they, fighting on and keeping fighting, and just the betrayal, the betrayal of people. I think for me, that is the horror of everything. It is just the horrific betrayal of everybody, of regular people on the ground, of the soldiers, of the people, I mean, and I don't know how to wake the rest of the world up, and I don't know how, because it is so complicated, but yet I hate using that word, because that's why people don't want to get involved in Gaza, and because it's complicated. No, genocide isn't. First of all, there's one side, the guy's doing it and the guy's experiencing it, and that's the genocide. You don't have to know the history to even call the genocide out. But have you noticed, I suppose I have loads of questions, but have you noticed any change in 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 an appetite for journalists to know more? That is, it still just that tiny little fraction that was perhaps always there? But do you notice even a change, maybe even in the last while, with kind of any journalists kind of who are willing? Because I do think, words are massively important, and we're fed a narrative. And if that narrative could change, that would change so much for people. Do you see any kind of how do you even think yourself in the last 10 years, with journalism and the way it's gone and all of that? And is there a hope that there could be a huge enough change? Like, I see you're just going, yeah, right. Well, what do you think?
If you're talking about mainstream media, and I unfortunately I would say no, because of course their job depends on them maintaining a narrative, so they're not going to change that narrative. And more and more so these days, I see mainstream media as being nothing more than an extension of intelligence and security services of their respective country. So there, no, unfortunately, I don't see there being any change. In fact, I see them literally cracking down with the use of AI and open source intelligence, and organizations like Bellingcat, and they're actually, taking it further. They're taking the censorship even further, with all of these fact checks and fake news identifiers and clubs that we don't belong in as independent journalists and so on. So no, I think that's one thing I do say is that I think the general public has kind of certainly cottoned on to what's going on to a large degree. BBC is nowhere near as popular as it used to be. It's losing public funding, as far as I understand. Of course, it's still being heavily financed by the British government. But as regards independent media, no, I think that is still, let's say, a growing market. I think, unfortunately, of course, what happens when something becomes successful, it usually gets infiltrated or influenced. And I do think we do see that to some degree. I'm, again, not going to name names, but I mean, that's an automatic response to something being successful in challenging power, because that's what the media should be doing. It should be challenging power. And of course, it doesn't. It represents power and hides the truth most of the time. If it does actually publish the truth, I always ask why. Why at this stage are they kind of giving us a little glimpse into the shenanigans that our government is carrying on? And when I say government, I also want to be very clear. I don't see any difference between left or right or Republican or Democrat. I see it as a deep state intelligence roadmap. And the president is chosen to carry out particular parts of that roadmap. I knew Trump was going to come back in long before, his campaign got running, because he's needed to do all these economic deals and to basically gravitate people, the Gulf states, Syria, and so on, towards the Abraham Accords and towards normalization with Israel, the isolation of Iran, the isolation of BRICS. the development of the India-Middle East economic corridor, which depends upon Gaza being obliterated and Palestinians basically being driven out of their land. You know, Trump was the only one that was going to be brought in to do that, just as he was brought in 2016 to carry out the assassination of Soleimani, to double down on the economic pressure against Syria, to give the Golan Heights to Israel. You know, this is Trump. This is what he does. And so for me, it was inevitable that he was going to be brought back in. He's also brought in because he, to some degree, leads people to believe that they can do deals, like we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine, like we're seeing with Iran, the kind of renaissance of the so-called nuclear deal and so on, which in my opinion is going to go nowhere. America is going to push Iran into another corner where it will pull out of the negotiations, and then America can go, see, look, they're not honest negotiators, so we'll go to war. That's what America does. That's their, you know, that's their script. That's the imperialist script. You don't give people an option. You only want a win-lose negotiation. You don't want a win-win, basically. Sorry, I've slightly lost my thread there.
That's great.
So as regards, I went off on one. As regards the media, look, there's always hope in independent media, but I think what I would say to anyone, find someone that you trust, find someone that you think has integrity. They're not going to be right all the time, but provided they're wrong with honesty and integrity, it doesn't matter. You don't have to agree with them all the time. And this is another point that I also want to make. People are very hard on independent media journalists. Like, we have to be right 100% of the time. We have to agree with you 100% of the time. No, we don't. But it doesn't mean that we're dishonest because we don't cover something you want us to cover, or we don't agree with you on a specific subject. I think all of us need to give each other a little bit more space to actually investigate and examine the facts before us. And don't be so impatient with us when, in your view, we might get it wrong. Because who knows, down the road, you might actually figure out we got it right. And you know, other people weren't paying attention. So I think you just have to find someone that you feel a rapport with, that you feel has integrity, that you feel is at least trying to get to the truth. I don't really like using the term truth because truth is subjective anyway, right? But at least is trying to get to the bottom of things genuinely, and is doing their best, like either by being on the ground, speaking to people on the ground. Let's not ignore the Palestinian voices, the Yemeni voices, the Lebanese voices, the Syrian voices, because those are the ones that count, not mine. My job is to transmit those voices, and that's what you should be looking for, not someone that's trying to kind of increase their media presence by piggybacking disasters in this region, whether it's genocide, whether it's government overthrow, whether it's occupation of territory. Look for people that are really trying to transmit what the people here are saying, because it's their voices that count. We shouldn't be looking to have a role in their future. It's not my job. My job is to speak for the Syrian people that I lived among, who are now suffering under what is happening. You know, it's not that they would necessarily want the Assad government to come back. They did also suffer, especially in the last 4 years, under the conditions in Syria that were exacerbated by the West. But they certainly don't want to be living under Jolani and under the Takfiri project and normalizing with Israel. I mean, that normalizing with what? The squatter state that was established by the Brits in 1948. Syria has withstood that since 1946 when it gained independence from the French mandate. Now it's going to normalize with a genocidal entity. I mean, this is just the most, when I spoke to my Syrian friends today over, you know, Trump lifting the sanctions, Jolani basically saying, yeah, you know, I'll normalize. They're in shock. They're already traumatized from what happened last year. But I mean, they're in irreconcilable shock. now. And this breaks my heart. This isn't what Syria should represent. It isn't what the region should represent.
Thanks, Dorothy, for your question and for your answer, Vanessa. We might take one more if you time, Vanessa. Are you all right with that?
Yeah, no worries.
Well, it's actually from Elle, and she put a comment in, or they put a comment in at the start to say, Vanessa, someone just told me that you were supposed to come to Liverpool, and the venue were told their funding would get pulled if the talk went ahead. Unbelievable. Like,
When was that?
so she's
Oh,
I'll go ahead and take the mic.
okay.
Yeah, I just text someone that I know that I was joining this meeting, and they just texted me that information. I don't know when it was, but I was in Liverpool at the time, and for various reasons I wasn't aware of that. But I just wanted to just make a contribution, left sort of not so much a question, but thanks so much, Vanessa. It's brilliant to hear what you have to say. It was just like echoing what Roisin you said about like what can we do, like I guess my take on it is like I think us lowly activists, I think we have to be like really full-throated in our support of the axis of resistance, because it's massively lacking in the left. Like I've spent the last 10 years like wasting so much time in various leftist organizations, and every time each organization I've moved further to the left, and in the end, like 100% Vanessa, what you said about infiltration is like fact, because like you just realize in the end you kind of have to do it yourself. And I actually think now like it's more beneficial that we do things like this and act more independently, but connect with each other. And like it was actually David Miller that brought me to both of you, even Social Rights for Ireland. And I went to the Chelmsford Action for Palestine meeting like last month, and it was so good because like suddenly it was connecting with other activists, and I just think we've got to do something. Like it is seriously bleak, and like but I think that we can you can see like in certain ways like people are waking up. Like I woke up when I realized that the organization I was in wasn't going to say anything about Assad, like and what was happening. And I was just like, it was just an eye-opener. I think more people will have these like light bulb moments. So yeah, that's just really what I wanted to say.
No, thank you for that. I mean, it's a very important point. Yeah, I mean, regarding and this is something else, and probably Roisin, I don't know whether you can maybe organize this kind of thing also, or collaborate with UK Column. We had a concept called Media on Trial, and what we basically did is book venues, and then people could buy tickets. And we used to get, I think in London, we had something like 500 people came to it. It was a big deal for the media at the time because they were getting very upset by it, because we were bringing people together. We had speakers, and then afterwards we were speaking personally to people. And I think that's really important. Like what you're doing here on Zoom is incredibly important, because you're giving people an opportunity to speak to like-minded individuals and to hear from people's experiences, which then potentially confirms what they were thinking, etc. And so gives them the courage to defend their position. Because I know one of the frustrations that I had in the West is this kind of, I don't know how to describe it really, but it's a Western privileged position of, yeah, resistance is okay, provided it's not armed. And I think, I think I hear what you're saying, Dorothy, about armies and so on. But, without the resistance, Palestine would have been gone long, long ago. Lebanon would have been invaded in 1982, and Israel onwards. Israel would never have left in the 2000s, right? Syria would not have withstood 75 years of attempted regime change and covert operations against the state. And God bless the Syrian Arab Army for what they did to prevent regime change. And yeah, I'm deeply saddened by the awful conditions that they're now in, many of them incarcerated. Of course, there are around 80,000 Syrian army soldiers in neighboring countries who managed to escape. There's a number of military in camps in Russia, etc. It's horrible. It's the complete kind of breakdown of a sovereign state, the destruction of what represents statehood, which is their capability to defend themselves, to maintain the state. It's gone. And I think, what is really important is to support armed resistance unconditionally. We're not in a position to project our Western privilege onto these countries, because these countries have been facing both internal and external pressure and tyranny and occupation and oppression for decades at the behest of our governments. I don't think we have a right to question armed resistance. It's up to them.
Yeah.
If they at the end of the day decide to lay down their weapons and surrender, it's also up to them. It's not up to us. I don't encourage, I'm not here, what's the word? It's not my job to endorse armed resistance, but I think we as activists should recognize the need for armed resistance and support it unconditionally, whether it's Syria, whether it's Yemen. I mean, Yemen, no other country has done what Yemen has done under the auspices of the Genocide Convention, Article 1 and 2, to punish and prevent genocide. That's what they're doing. And what is America doing? Bombing them for trying to prevent genocide. I mean, our moral compass is off kilter if we don't support this. And someone actually said to me the other day, yeah, but you should be condemning Yemen for not providing salaries and not providing food. Well, hang on, who is blockading Yemen under UN Resolution 2216? Saudi Arabia, the West, UAE, Israel. And UN Resolution 2216 was bringing in sanctions against 7 named individuals, not 23 Yemenis. So who's at fault for what is happening in Yemen? Not the Yemenis. And it's not about the Houthis, it's about the Yemeni people, because the huge majority of the Yemeni people support resistance on behalf of Palestine, or on behalf actually of any oppressed nation. And so therefore I think that's what Elle said is an incredibly important point, and that's one that is, I would say, deliberately ignored by many of the organizations in the West, is that armed resistance is a right enshrined in international law, and it should be supported as such. Hamas and Hezbollah should not be proscribed terrorist organizations in the UK. What threat are they to the national security of the UK? They're not. They're a threat to the national security of Israel. So who does our government represent? Do they represent British citizens, or do they represent Zionist citizens?
Yeah, and the whole question of what is a terrorist, that's, look, within our context and having grown up in the North during the war as well, Vanessa, like, where the great song actually to Joe McDonough, one of the hunger strikers, and the lyrics go, "And you dare to call me a terrorist while you look down your gun. When I think of all the things that you have done." I'll not sing it because I need a few drinks on me to sing. Very good at singing it.
Oh, please do.
We'll sing it another time. No, but all joking aside, thank goodness we are finally interrogating the definition of terrorism, and it does my heart good to hear the chants on the street when we say USA #1 terrorist state,
Yeah.
and we forever say Israel is a terrorist fascist state, and they will try to suppress our right to say that through things like the Irish government are want to bring in the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, but we will still say it. It won't stop us, from pointing the finger at the real terrorists. So, and I feel in a way, as a Northerner, I feel in a way vindicated. So many of our freedom fighters were vilified, even by the Dublin government, by the Free State, and by people in the South and in the North, but less so amongst people who were victims of the imperialist bloody war as well. So I think it's really important for the survivors of what is known as the Troubles to know that their fathers, their brothers, their sisters, and members of their family were not terrorists. They were freedom fighters. And that's why language really matters as well. We talk about our martyrs and our heroes like Bobby Sands or whatever. So that context really matters to us here in Ireland. Totally different type of war, obviously. And that's but it's related to. Thank you so much for your time.
I don't think the differences are that great.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to ever suggest that what people of Palestine are going through now is, comparable to what we suffered. But the divide and rule tactics continue.
Yeah.
And I mean, the Yanks have been taught well by the Brits in that regard when it comes to imperialism.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's lovely to hear you, Elle. It's lovely to hear, Victoria, you're coming from, I think, Britain as well. It's lovely to have different voices, different people turning up and contributing. I think it's really important. And like you, it resonates, Elle. I think I was running from one group to another and hoping that there would be political parties that do something. And they're like, no, it's not even that we have to build a party. We have to build a movement. And we're capable. We are the experts. We don't need to hand over and keep relinquishing our working class power, as I would see it.
Yeah,
definitely.
So keep coming and we'll reconnect, and maybe we'll have a media trial, like you said, Vanessa. We'll put the media on trial in Dublin. It would be great. That would be great.
We'll have a word with Mike at UK Column, and I'm sure we can organise something and collaborate on it, which would be really good.
Thanks, Vanessa. It's been a pleasure, and it's an eye-opener. And I think, Stephen, it's all right to say we're enlightened, because it's better to come out of the dark, even if the light that we're seeing makes us feel very uncomfortable, or in my case, feeling a bit stupid for the things that I thought to be real, So thanks, Vanessa. Keep up the great work. And I hope that more people here will continue to share and spread your work. Slán go fáil, Free Palestine.
Free
Palestine. Thank you so much,
Vanessa.
everyone.
Free Palestine.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Bye-bye.
Free Palestine.
Slán.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Slán.
Bye-bye.